BSides DC 2017 videos are brought to you by Threat Quotient, introducing the industry's first threat intelligence platform designed to enable threat operations and management, and Data Tribe, a new kind of startup studio co-building the next generation of commercial cybersecurity, analytics, and big data product companies.
Well, we're here today to talk about PCI, and more specifically, PCI for pen testers. Now, my name is Joseph Perini. I am Vice President of Technical Services for PSC. The PSC is a QSA company, which means we help organizations become compliant with the data security standard. Now, I've run the pen test team for about 9 years or so, but I actually started as a qualified security advisor. That means I was an auditor, and if I got to be honest, I suck at being an auditor, because frankly, I get really bored sitting in a room 8 hours a day, people telling you that they're compliant, and my eyes kind of glaze over, and I just don't trust it. I like being a pen tester because I don't have to take people's word for whether or not they're compliant. I get to check. Now, my team does about 400 to 500 pen tests a year. Now, we don't do all of the pen tests for our customers, so over the last 9 years, that means I've been able to see quite a number of third-party pen tests. And some of them have been pretty good, and some of them have been really bad. But mostly why is this flipping back and forth? There we go. But ultimately, doing it this long, I've become really passionate about pen testing and PCI. So much so that I co-sponsored the special interest group on penetration testing back in 2015. And I wrote great big sections of the guidance that came out. So I hope I know what I'm talking about at this point. So let's talk about some background here. What is PCI? All right. Back in April 1993, CERN went ahead and released the World Wide Web into the public domain. That's when the internet was born. Now, it's been said that two things drive the internet: porn and e-commerce. And there's a lot of both. Now, this e-commerce on the internet spawns a whole new avenue of fraud. And the card brands are just getting hammered on a regular basis. So, in the fall of 1999, Visa says enough is enough, and they create their first security program for merchants. And it was called the Cardholder Information Security Program, or the CISP. So, great. All the other card brands go, yes, me too, and they go out and they create their unique security programs for merchants. Now, Visa says, all right, everybody, you've got to be compliant in 2001. And that date comes and goes, and nobody's compliant. Well, why? Well, think about it for a second. If you're a merchant, you've got 5 different security programs that you're trying to be compliant with. And the card brands, they don't necessarily get along together. So you could be compliant for Discover, but that doesn't necessarily make you compliant, say, for Visa or for MasterCards. So it's a real mess. Now, if you're a hacker, this is awesome, because we've got all these new e-commerce sites out there, and they're all running on IIS with ASP, and there's SQL injection everywhere, and you can't swing a dead cat in any direction without hitting a poorly protected e-commerce site. Now, CyberSource says back in 2000 that there will be $1.5 billion in online revenue lost to fraud, and that number is going to triple over the next decade. So, in 2004, the 5 card brands get together and they say, we're going to create this thing called the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, and they release version 1. Now, in 2006, due to feedback, they create this thing called the Payment Card Industry Security Data Standard Council to help the standard and to help guide merchants become compliant. So since then, this council has given us 8 different versions of the standard. So what is the council supposed to do? Well, the council is supposed to oversee the standard. Now, they don't do it by themselves. They take input from participating organizations, which are really large merchants and service providers, and they take input from the QSAs, and they take input from the card brands. Now, they're also responsible for certifying the qualified security advisors, making sure they know what they're doing when they go in the field to help merchants become compliant. They also manage this thing called an ASV program, or an approved scanning vendor, which you need to have scan you quarterly in order to be PCI compliant. Now, the council does a whole bunch of other stuff too. They do an internal security assessor program. They do a payment application QSA program. They do a PCI forensic investigator for when your security didn't work out the way you thought it was going to. They do a PCI professional program, PIN transaction security, point-to-point encryption. They even have a program for qualified integrators and resellers, the people who are responsible for installing payment applications and point of sale. So they cover quite a bit. Now, who has to be compliant? Well, basically anybody that takes a credit card, regardless of size, has to be PCI compliant. And you're going to fall into one of two buckets, right? You're either going to be a merchant or you're going to be a service provider. Now, a merchant is defined as anyone who takes a payment card with the logo of one of the 5 card brands. Great. So if I have a Swipe, I've got a Cafe, if I'm Amazon.com, I'm a merchant. Now, the other group is a service provider, and they're defined as a business entity who isn't a card brand, but they're directly involved in the processing, storage, or transmission of cardholder data. So these are companies that provide services that could impact the security of the cardholder data environment. So a good example of that would be, say, Iron Mountain. Now, Iron Mountain's got a bunch of tapes that they're taking back and forth, and they contain card data. So to some extent, they need to be PCI compliant. If I'm a managed services provider and I manage the firewalls for a merchant, I have some responsibility of being PCI compliant because I could impact the security of that merchant. If I handle the point of sale systems for a bunch of restaurants, again, I'm a service provider and I have to be PCI compliant. Now, compliant with what? Well, in total, there are 416 individual requirements, which are, broken into 12 or basically 6 different control objectives. And they are build and maintain a secure network, protect cardholder data, maintain a vulnerability management program, implement strong access control measures, regularly test and monitor networks, that's interesting, and then maintain an information security policy. So which bits do we, as pen testers, care about? So there are 4 requirements that get our attention. The first one is requirement 6.5, which is to address common coding vulnerabilities. Well, this basically tells us that we need to use OWASP Top 10 and the CWE 25 when we are assessing web applications. And then 6.6 requires that you review public-facing web applications. And there are 3 ways that you can do this. You can, as a merchant, you can either do a static source code review, or you could use a web application vulnerability assessment tool, or you could just skip your code altogether and you can just put a web application firewall in front of your web app, and that will help you meet that requirement. Then requirement 11.2 is about vulnerability scanning, and this is for both your internal and your external. Now, anybody can do your internal vulnerability scanning, but your external has to be done by an approved scanning vendor. Now, 11.3, the requirement for internal and external penetration testing can be done by anyone who's qualified. So there isn't a certification for them. So now we've got this PCI standard, right? We've got 416 requirements now. Everything's hunky-dory. It came out in 2006, and we're good, right? No. Boom. I mean, the first one was TJX, and it was, multi-million-dollar compromise. And if you look, it's like every year since the PCI standard came out, there's been some major hack. What the hell? This was supposed to fix this. Why are we still having this issue? Well, merchants will tell you it's because the standard's ineffective, it's too hard to implement, and it costs too much money. And then security professionals will argue that it doesn't go far enough and it's all about checking the box. Okay, great. So who's at fault? Well, I've given this some thought. I've been doing this since PCI came out, and I think I've got the answer. If you think PCI is crap, it's because you're doing it wrong. I believe that we're to blame. So I believe the claim by some that PCI is nothing more than a bunch of kids with clipboards running around merchants checking off checkboxes is probably pretty accurate for a lot of QSAs. And pen testers aren't blameless either. I've read some tragically bad pen test reports. I mean, the report was pretty. Oh, it was gorgeous. It had great graphics. It had, professional fonts. It had pie charts galore. The whole thing screamed professional. But when you read it, it was nothing more than a Nessa scan in a dress. So a PCI isn't easy. And if merchants, could figure this out on their own, they wouldn't need us. They wouldn't need assessors. I think some of the problem is that the security firms and pen testers in particular haven't really looked at the standard. I mean, looked at it, dug into it, and pulled some guidance out of it. The other problem is being an assessor of any type is a really awkward position to be in. So if you do your job too well, your client hates your guts. You'll hear things like, oh, he asks too many questions, he digs too deep, he's too hard on us. Great. If you do a crappy job, though, your client gets breached, and then everybody wants to know who the assessor was because they did a crappy job. Pen testing is kind of the same. Raise your hands if you've ever done a great job on a pen test and somebody got fired. Yeah. Awkward. So, at the same time, if you don't do a good job, there are 5 other companies just waiting in the wings for you to screw up and take your customer away from you. So I honestly think that to some degree, there are many companies who are just afraid of rocking the boat for fear of losing a client. And I think that needs to stop. We need to, as pen testers, we've got to understand the standard and then develop an accurate and effective approach to performing our pen tests. We also need to be willing to stand our ground and educate the customer when maybe we don't all agree on what the outcome of a pen test means. So let's talk about some of the common challenges for both clients and for pen testers. I think the biggest one for clients is that this wasn't their idea. I mean, think about it. Nobody wakes up in the morning and goes, damn, we should be PCI compliant. Let's go out and get a PCI pen test. No, they don't. They have to. They are required to do this stuff. And I honestly think that affects their willingness to cooperate and engage. The other thing is that PCI can get really expensive. So you've got to if you're a merchant or a service provider, you've got to go out and get an assessor. Then you've got to get your ASV scans. And then you've got to get your pen tests, internal and external, web application. And then if you've got a payment application, you might have to have that looked at too. Then they're going to find things. And those things are going to cost money. You're going to have to upgrade software. You might have to buy hardware. You're going to have to implement certain security controls. It's going to be inconvenient, and it's going to get expensive really quick. The other problem is that pen testing has a real tough time demonstrating value. And when a customer has a lot of demands for their budget, I think pen testing is a great place for them to cut corners. Now, the other thing is that the standard doesn't always scale. It doesn't always work for smaller customers. PCI, there can be technical and financial barriers for smaller companies to go ahead and really embrace PCI. In some cases, it takes a full-time person. And if all you got is a system admin who's already wearing multiple hats, then you are probably not going to do a really good job of PCI. Now, what are some of the challenges for pen testers? Well, there aren't very clear instructions on how we're supposed to do this. There are no cut and dry rules about how a pen test is supposed to be done. So that's why we're here today. I'm going to call out where we can get that information. And then there's no PCI certification for pen testers. Now, for the quarterly external scans, you have to get an ASV, an approved scanning vendor. And these companies go through an annual baseline testing, which means that the council can be assured of a relative level of consistency. Well, there's no such consistency with pen testers. So pen test companies really don't know what they're getting or whether or not the pen test company they hired is even qualified to do the job. So, and then lastly, I think for us, and I've said it before, is I think we're afraid to push too hard. A PCI really is supposed to have teeth. If a merchant or a service provider is not compliant, their acquirer will start to levy fines. And these fines can quickly add up, and in some cases, it can put a smaller company out of business. Well, I don't think we want to be the bad guys. And like I said, if we hold them accountable or if we're too good, there's that fear that they're just going to go find another company that's just easier and softer and we'll just go ahead and let them pass. But again, I think if we educate ourselves and we educate our customers and we can start looking for ways to bring value beyond just checking the box on a list of requirements, we could make PCI real security. So how are we supposed to pen test? Well, there are 4 primary documents that we're going to get some information out of. The PCI Data Security Standard Testing Procedures has a testing procedures, a 139-page framework for assessing merchants. And inside of it, it includes testing procedures and additional guidance around the specific requirements. So we're going to want to look at that. And then the 2017 Penetration Testing Guidance. I got to say, I'm quite proud of this one because I spent over a year working with other security companies and merchants and service providers and participating organizations, and we took input from the card brands, and we put together a document that was published in 2015. If you ever get a chance to do a PCI SIG, I say do it. Just jump into it. It's going to take some time, but you'll be amazed. It's quite enlightening what it takes to get everybody who's got a different agenda and different ideas to all finally come together and agree on something. It's a lot of work, and it's pretty amazing. Now, the ASV program guide covers pretty much the mechanics of being an ASV, but we're going to glean a few ideas out of that as well. And then lastly, there's this guidance for PCI DSS scoping and segmentation. And this introduces the concept of a connected system. So a connected system is anything that talks into the cardholder data environment that could impact the security if compromised. That's a connected system. So we're going to look at those documents. Now let's dig into these a little bit and see what information we can glean from them. So from the testing procedures and guidance, this is a good piece of information. This is the key takeaway. We are required to simulate a real-world attack situation and identify how far we can penetrate into the environment. That's awesome, because that kind of changes things and kind of sets the whole tone for how the pen test should be performed. This does not mean we get to run a vulnerability scan, slap our logo on it, and call it a pen test anymore. This could be real fun. This document also tells us that we need to target the CDE and the connected systems. Cool. Now we know exactly what we're going for. It gives us permission to exploit identified vulnerabilities. I don't know if you've ever had a pen test where the customer said, no, you can't do exploitation or post-exploitation. It's like, well, then what am I doing here? This isn't a pen test. This gives us permission to do that. It also says, though, we need to use a defined, accepted third-party methodology. So you can't use Bob's House of Pen Testing as a way of doing it. You've got to use something that's known, the NIST 800-115 or the open source security testing methodology. Use something like that. Base your approach on that. And then it says that we have to do this at least annually and after any significant change. There's always a question of, well, what's a significant change? And the answer is always, well, it depends. A significant change is traditionally anything that could impact the security of the cardholder data environment. So For example, now, let's say the customer changes a firewall rule. Is that a significant change? Probably not. You could just run Nmap again and make sure that all the firewall rules look, or Nipper or something, to just make sure the firewall rules look okay. Or let's say you had cross-site scripting in a web application and you fixed that. All right, well, we'll just check for that. We don't have to test the whole app again. But maybe you add a whole new network, or you re-architect your application and add new functionality. Those would be significant changes that should trigger another pen test, and that will require for you to come out and again work with your customer. So I've been talking about this thing, cardholder data environment and CDE, so we should probably define this. And the council defines this as the people, processes, and technology that store, process, or transmit cardholder data, which is the PAN, the primary account numbers, or sensitive authentication data, which in part is the 3 numbers on the back of your credit card. So it includes this thing called people. So that's kind of means that we're not just attacking a static set of IPs or applications. This changes things now. We have to go after the people who are part of the CDE. And these are traditionally defined as the privileged users who have access to or are responsible for managing the cardholder data environment, or they use in-scope applications. Well, think about it for a second. We get to hack them. So now that means maybe we can look at other stuff that they use in their day-to-day job, their internal corporate domain. Now we're beginning to take a look at a bigger picture. Now if you just said, okay, all I'm going to do is hack the CDE, you just point your tools at it, you look at the perimeter, you'd walk away, they're fine. But now if we look at what our CDE requirements are, we've got these people that we can start to go after. Let's dig into the pen testing guidance. So you would think that pen test companies would know the difference between a pen test and a vulnerability scan. But I have seen some reports that demonstrate quite the opposite. Now, we originally did this for merchants because a lot of merchants really don't know the difference. But it was good for some pen test companies, too. We also talked about, in this document, black box versus gray box testing. Now, I am quite the advocate of gray box testing. I think it's a better value proposition for customers than going in blind. A lot of what we're going to do in a black box test is just look for, your architecture, your IPs. We got to figure all that stuff out, and we will get there. But we will spend a couple of extra weeks doing it, and we're going to have to go through all your emails, and we're going to have to find your Visio diagrams. Tell you what, we could save a lot of time and money if you just give it to us up front, and that's again better value for the customer. This document also talks about what to look for in a penetration tester if you're a merchant trying to hire them, or if you're a QSA looking at somebody's report trying to figure out whether or not they knew what they were doing. But we talked about some of the key certifications, things like the OSCP. We did not say that having a CISSP makes you a pen tester. So we're trying to offer some real guidance on it. Then we also added this consideration for social engineering, and I wrote this myself because I was quite insistent that we bring up social engineering. One of the things I don't understand is that in the standard and in PCI, we don't really talk about it. But if you look at all the major breaches, there has always been some element of social engineering, even if all it was a phishing attack. And why we don't test for it or educate or have that conversation about it blows my mind. But this year I went ahead and proposed another SIG, specifically just on social engineering. Now, it's not a sexy topic, and it's got a snowball's chance in hell of actually getting selected, but I'm hoping it does, because then if it does, we can start to put together some sort of guidance about how to do this effectively without demoralizing your users and getting some real benefit from it. And then we also put together some report content guidelines, because a lot of the reports that we were all seeing are just all over the map. You couldn't really tell what the report was about, and in some cases you couldn't even tell at the end of it whether or not the customer was compliant. So the ASB program, the third document that we're going to pull information out. Like I said before, it's mostly about the mechanics of being an ASV, but there's a couple of things that we can pull out of here that are important to us. Number one, it tells the ASVs that they must use either NVD or CVSS for setting their severity levels. Cool. Because please, do me a favor. Stop making up your own severity levels. I know what you're trying to do. I've seen the reports. You're trying to stand out. You're trying to do something that's unique and you put your stamp on it. But really, all you're doing is confusing people. You're rarely more effective than the existing third-party standards. And what happens is you end up really messing up the remediation process, because then the customer doesn't know what to prioritize. They've got one document that says one thing, and then they've got another document that says something else, and they never quite match because you were coming up and calling it by different things. Let's stop. We can use this to put together some sort of common severity language. Great. Then we're all on the same page. Again, let's make it easier on the customers. And then the ASV program called out these things called automatic failures. It's kind of cool. So you automatically fail. No argument. We're not going to discuss it. You fix it if we find out-of-date or obsolete operating systems in the CDE. You're running Windows 2003? Not unless you've got an extended Microsoft contract. You got 2000? Doesn't matter. You're fixing it. Other things were, if I find a database open from the internet, guess what? You automatically fail. For God's sake, go fix that now. If you're using default credentials, Tomcat on anything, it's an automatic fail. And then we talked about other things like web application securities, cross-site scripting, SQL injection, directory traversals. These were all automatic fails. Cool. We didn't have to have any discussion, negotiation, or argument. And then some other things that are kind of interesting were information disclosures that they consider an automatic fail. If you reveal the internal IP address scheme through a web application call or something like that, you expose it to the internet, that's an automatic fail. You got to go fix it. Verbose error messages, you got to fix them. Revealing source code, you got to fix it. So the ASV program kind of gave us some things that we could arm ourselves when we're doing a test with, so that when we communicate to the customer, it's very cut and dry and very clear what they have to do. We want that. We want to make sure that the customers know what they have to do so that they're not confused. All right, the guidance for PCI DSS scoping and segmentation is another document that we can kind of pull some info over it. I hear a lot of times, why are you looking at that? That's not in scope for PCI. Our QSA didn't want to have anything to do with that. I'm like, well, you know what? Maybe, maybe not. Just because it's not in scope doesn't mean we shouldn't maybe look at it. So this guidance kind of gave me a little justification for that behavior. It also talked about the connected systems that need to be in scope. The other thing it talks about, too, it's a good reminder, is connections from third parties. Now, let's say you're a service provider. You provide a banking application, and you've got a whole bunch of credit unions across the United States that connect into you. Well, have you ever done a pen test from one of your customers? You're like, well, no, they're our customers. We would never do a pen test from there. Well, why not? You don't know what that risk is. You don't know what that connectivity looks like. You don't know if somebody screwed it up, for example, until you actually test it. And this document says, hey, you know what? You need to consider it. And the other thing it tells us is that we need to do segmentation testing. So a customer who has using segmentation to keep certain parts of their network separate from the CDE, well, we got to test those segmentation. And I'll talk more about that later in the presentation. So there's always an argument around scoping. The QSAs argue it. You go to the PCI council meetings, you hear it between the council members and QSAs. Merchants want to argue it. And I've got the answer. It's pretty simple. It's not out of scope if it can be used against you. Let's face it. I mean, hackers do not have scoping rules. Why do we let the merchants put limits on it? We've seen organizations get nailed out of left field, right? We target. We don't know where it's coming from. Now, if we were just focusing on the systems that the QSA has to look at, we're going to miss a whole bunch. So if we increase our scope so that it's basically everything, then we have a greater chance of protecting our customer. Now, it does mean that you're going to have to stop and educate your customer, explain the risks, and that's okay. It's an extra step in our process, but we're experts, and clients do want us to guide them, so let's do that. Now, does this mean we get to go all medieval all over their networks? No. We do have to act responsibly and reasonably, and we do that using set of guidelines called the rules of engagement. We're all familiar with that, right? Have you ever had a pen test with a really whacked out set of rules of engagement where I had a bank, they told us, if you find a password, you can't reuse it because somebody might get offended. Okay. You couldn't do anything exploitive. God forbid you look in somebody's email. By the time we were done, we were like, okay, you could have done all of this yourself, but we're happy to do this. I mean, we like your money, but it's not really valuable for you. So the best part of PCI is that it sets the rules of engagement for us. What we do is we go back to that original primary objective. The intent of the penetration test is to simulate a real-world attack with the goal of identifying how far an attacker can penetrate into the environment. Now, we get to be exploitive. We get to chain attacks together. There isn't anything here that says, well, you can't do that. No, you can't do that. It basically says we can do everything. We get to do a damn good pen test for a change. This is awesome. Now, does this mean we get to do crazy stuff? No. How do we meet this intent and do it safely? There are some common things that we need to discuss. First off, don't bother with any denial of service attacks. Think about it. If you knock over a server with a whole bunch of card data in it, well, that's probably going to be about as secure as it's ever going to be. Because if you can't get to the card data, right, it's good. So there's that. The other thing is you need to have a discussion up front with your customer about how you're going to handle risky and fragile infrastructure. So if you've got a customer, let's say a business, financial institutions, a lot of these will have mainframes. Right? If you scan a mainframe, it locks up. And then you've got this really uncomfortable conversation with the stakeholders and your customer, and you're probably not going to be invited back. So get a hold of them first. Talk to them about this. What do you have in the environment that could be affected? Ask them the question. Have you ever done a scan or a pen test before and something went south? And then talk about that and decide, how are we going to handle this? We can't just not test it, but we can come up with better ways. Maybe rather than doing automated tools, we're going to have to do it with some more manual stuff. Maybe if it's a web application, what we could do is we could test it in staging. So testing and staging versus production. Can you do that? Sure, why not? But you need to have some criteria that you set with your customer. First off, the code base has to be the same. Can't be a version before, it can't be a version after, it's got to be dead on. And also make sure that whatever environment they give you is stable. A lot of time that staging environment is like the old rickety box that's underneath somebody's desk. Make sure that they're not changing it, that it's not a dynamic environment, that it's stable and the code is static. And if you can do that, then great. You can go ahead and test in staging. If you can't, well, maybe you should talk about when to test. Maybe testing during off-peak hours is the way to do this. I prefer testing during the day. I prefer testing with realistic traffic. Real-world attacks happen at all hours. They don't happen, at 2 o'clock in the morning necessarily. So I like it during the day because a couple of reasons. If I have a question, I can pick up the phone and somebody's going to answer. If there's a problem, there are resources that can immediately respond to it. So this is good. Now, I do have some customers that'll say, well, you've got to test it at night. That's fine. We'll test it at night. But you've got to promise that you're going to pick up the phone and you're going to answer the call when I call because I've got a question, or when you didn't give me something or something's not responding right. So you kind of have to negotiate this with your customer to make sure that you get everybody on board. And be careful about customers that do things like say, well, you can test, but you can only test in a 2-hour maintenance window. Knock yourselves out, guys. If you want me to do this in a 2-hour maintenance window, then I'm going to have to double the amount of time that I'm going to spend on this, because the stop and start thing really screws with the efficiency. And it also increases the likelihood that something bad could happen inside a system. So usually I push back and shoot for at least 6-hour windows for testing. Depends upon the customer, but most of the time, if you take the time to explain what the risks are, you can get some agreement. Now, when do you stop? Well, that's the other cool thing about PCI, is that it actually sets the success criteria pretty clear for us. We knew what our targets were. We had to go after the CDE, and we have to go after connected systems. Well, cool. Having an established success criteria prevents us from going too far, and it also makes it easier for everybody to know when we're doing a good job. So maybe just compromising the perimeter of the CDE is success criteria, and we're done. Great. Or maybe they've got this setup where they use a jump box, SSH into it, RSA key, whatever, to get into the CDE. And if you can compromise that intermediary box, you're good. Great. That's the success criteria. I've had some customers that have said, hey, look, if you compromise our corporate domain, we're good. We're done. We know it's just a matter of time at that point. I love those customers. Those guys are engaged. They know what their risks are. Or even something like access to source code. It's going to be different for every customer. You just want to make sure that you sit down and document it with them so that you don't go too far. And if you do get into the CDE, stop. Don't get cocky. Don't try and prove the point and go, well, we're going to get credit card data out. Well, no, you're not, because things go south really quick, and the next thing you know, havoc, alarms go off. Got to remember, the CDE is a money-making vehicle for the customer. You do not want to interfere with that because you do want to be invited back. Okay, I'm not going to tell you how to do pen testing. You know how to do pen testing, but let's talk about some unique characteristics of PCI pen testing. So for the external pen tests, they're actually probably some of the easier ones because they're like anything else. HIPAA, a regular pen test, and every every application pen test is the same. They follow the typical pen test approach of discovery, enumeration, vulnerability scanning, exploitation, post-exploitation. There's no magic in PCI for that one. But be real clear that most companies have no idea what they have. So asset management, especially for some reason in PCI, is going to be a real mess. So what you can do is take whatever IPs or targets they give you and compare that with the ASV scans, because they should be the same. And if they're not, bring it up. One of them is wrong. And if it's wrong, you want to make sure that you're making your customer aware and that you come to some sort of conclusion. The other thing is try to expand the scope as much as possible. Take what they've given you, do some OSINT on it, and then take that back to the customer and go, hey, we found all this other stuff. And ask the question this way. Don't ask them if it's in scope, because they'll go no. Ask them if any of this stuff could impact the security of the cardholder data environment, because that's key. It's not about scope. It's about impacting the CDE or getting in. So try and poke at that a little bit. If you can do that with the externals, then you're doing okay. The internals are a little bit more complicated. So the internals are definitely harder to scope, and they're definitely harder to price, because usually a lot of your scoping and pricing is just based on static IPs and number of web apps, and that's not how the internal pen tests are going to work. Because everything's in scope, it's not out of scope if it can be used against you, you need to have a pretty damn good understanding of that customer's environment. And ask them the question, not just what do you sell, but ask them how do you sell it? So a lot of customers are going to have multiple channels. So they might have e-commerce, they might have brick and mortar, they might have a call center. All of these places are going to be where card data is going to be coming in. So get an understanding of that up front before you scope it, because you don't want to underscope, you don't want to put too little resource and too little time on this. And then when you're there, remember, you're attacking the privileged users. Yes, you're going to have some opportunity to go right at the cardholder data environment, and there might be some instances where it's wide open and you're in. Those are boring. Those are 20-minute pen tests. But as your customer matures, it's going to get harder. Now you're going to have to go after those privileged users. And look at non-traditional networks. Don't just think Corp and CDE. Go after the VoIP. Go after climate control. Go after the guest networks. Guest networks rapidly become de facto Corp networks because everybody's too lazy to get on the Corp network. Printer networks. I mean, these things, it's weird. They don't get the same attention. And I know in a pen test before, I've gone ahead, plugged into a VoIP network, and had access into this other system, and then I could pivot through that right into the CDE. So peek at it. Take a look at it. Don't trust the scope. And I said that before in the externals, and this is kind of a theme. Customers don't know what they have. They'll give you this list of IP addresses. Let's say they've got 4 Class Cs in a 10-dot network. Well, do they have 4 Class Cs? Do they have 20 Class Cs? It doesn't hurt to run mass scan real quick across a /8 and say, hey, what are all these other networks that came up? Pull all the machines out of the domain and convert those to IP addresses. Look at the networks that they're on. Poke at this thing a little bit. See if you can get more information out of the customer. And finally, automate as much as you can, because you are fighting time. That is the downside and the limitation to PCI pen testing. It's all about efficiency and a trade-off of time. So if you can automate and be more efficient, you're going to do a better job for your customer. All right, reporting. No one likes doing the reports. Everybody loves doing the pen tests. The pen tests are cool, but doing the reports suck. And it shows. In a lot of pen test reports that I read, it really shows that nobody's into them. But these are some of the things that you should have in the pen test report for PCI. All right? Executive summary, we all know that. A statement of scope. This is important. You need to document this. What was in scope? What did you test? Where did you test from? What was included? And then you need to put in your statement of the methodology. That's kind of required so that the QSA looks at it and goes, okay, they weren't winging this. They didn't make this up. And then your statement of limitations. Now, if you had some limitations, well, we couldn't test during these time frames, or this system we had to do manually. Great. Put it in the document. That way the customer knows that there might have been some limitations and they didn't get full coverage. That's okay, but document it. And then testing narrative. Now, this is more me than PCI. The way I want my pen testers to write the reports is I want them to do a chronological narrative with the exact tools and techniques and the syntax for what they did. I've had customers come to me and go, we really don't want to fix any of this because we think you're magic and we don't think normal people could do this and we don't think this really can't happen. There isn't really a risk. Okay. I'm management. I'm not that good. If I can get in, that's a problem. So in our reports, if we can put a testing narrative in there that is real clear, and so that even a junior Windows administrator could do what we do, they can replicate our results, okay, then we have made this real. This is now something that isn't imaginary or theoretical. This is a real attack. That's good. We've brought value. We've demonstrated that this has some tangible value to the organization. And then finally, some segmentation results need to be in your pen test reports. And then your findings need to be clearly documented. Let's talk about findings. So in your findings, what I like, and the first one is, again, more me, less PCI. But you're going to run into situations where you're doing a PCI pen test and the internal corporate network is Swiss cheese. They really have paid no attention to it. But they did a good job of keeping you out of the CDE. So now what do you do? How do you write this up? Well, I like to write it up just as normal, just as if it were the same severity levels that for anything else, but instead now we just indicate whether or not we could use it to get into the CDE. And if we couldn't, they don't have to fix it. But we brought it to their attention, and we brought it to their attention with the real severity level. Why is this important? Well, now they can use our report to handle or to affect other regulatory regimes. I mean, if you could have gotten into HR and finance, that's important. They should know about that sort of thing. And now you've created a report that they used for PCI, but now has value in other areas. So that makes the penetration test report more valuable. You need to put in the risk and severity, and again, not a risk and severity you make up on your own. Use something that's established. I know that CVSS does not work for every finding, but try and do it as closely as possible to some third-party methodology. Put in the targets affected, references. If you can find blog postings about the vulnerability, great, do that. Put in your description. Another thing, it's not required, but it's a good idea, is put in the steps the customer can take to test remediation. This is going to help them. You're going to find remediation is always a challenge. And if you can show them how to test that they fixed it, this will make retesting a lot easier. Okay, a word about segmentation testing. I promised I was going to discuss it. Segmentation testing is required by requirement 11.34, which says you must test all out-of-scope networks for all segmentation methods to make sure that they are effective. Cool. Well, that can also be a lot of work. Well, how are you supposed to do it? Well, the penetration testing guidance says that you can use the first two phases of a penetration test, which is discovery and enumeration, which is Nmap, right? So you could run mass scan or Nmap from an out-of-scope network towards the CDE, and that would satisfy segmentation testing. The problem you may run into is that you've got customers with hundreds of out-of-scope networks. The nice thing is that this requirement came out at the exact time we were doing the SIGs, so we were able to draw it to everybody's attention that this is nuts. You're going to have people spending days doing segmentation testing, costing hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's not worth it. So we came out, and in the guidance we do have sampling is okay. What that sample size is, I can't tell you. Needs to be reasonable. Could be 10%, could be 25%. You'll know your customer better. It depends upon the number of networks. If it's 100 networks, maybe you do segmentation testing from 10 or 15. If it's 10 networks, maybe you do all of them. You're just going to have to kind of take a look at that on a case-by-case basis. Now, something that's changing is service providers have a greater responsibility. They have more cards, and therefore they are required now to do segmentation testing twice a year. Now, they may not necessarily ask you to do it, and that's okay. Teach your customer how to do it on their own, because the requirement doesn't say that it has to be done by a pen test company or an ASV or anything. It just needs to be done. So you're not going to run back out there just to run mass scan or Nmap, and you're not going to send out an appliance because you can't move that from network to network to network. Teach them how to do it themselves. Teach them how to document it. Again, you're bringing value to your customer, and that's going to get you invited back. It's going to let you do a better pen test. Okay, issues on remediation. Follow me along with this one. So let's say we hack a client like this. They've got WPA2. I grab the handshake, I pull it down, I crack it, and I jump on their network. Then I do LLMNR and NBNS with Responder, and I grab some more hashes. And you know what? Summer 2017. I've got a credential. Fantastic. So now I Kerberos their domain and grab their service provider name hashes, and I throw those up in the GPU cracker and give it 4 or 6 hours. And hey, I've got a domain admin cred. Cool. So now I take that and I attack those privileged users, and with that I get on their box and I wait for them to connect to the CDE, and then I pivot through and I've got my success criteria. I present this to the customer and they come back to me and they say, you know what? We're just going to fix that first thing. We're just going to fix the WPA2. Because the way we figure it is if you couldn't get that, you wouldn't have been able to get all this other stuff. All right, well, this is what I tell my customers. Pen testing is really about doing two things. It's about finding initial vectors and about finding escalation paths. Now let's go back to the biggest limitation we have with PCI, which is time. Frankly, I may only be able to get one initial vector during the time that I'm there, and then I got to find the escalation paths. So yeah, there's a chance I could have missed one. Or tomorrow there could be a new vulnerability which opens up another initial vector, which means that if you only fix that one, there's a chance somebody's going to come around, find the other, and all those escalation paths are still going to be there. And you have accomplished really nothing in terms of securing your environment. So we tell them, you've got to remediate everything in the attack chain. You can't just do that first one. Again, we're pushing back a little bit on the customer, but if you explain the risk, you increase your value. So the other thing I get is, you know what? We've decided as an organization that we're going to accept the risk on that vulnerability. No, you're not. There is no risk assessment or risk acceptance in PCI. The only people that get to accept the risk are the card brands, because it's not your risk to accept. It's cardholder data. And only the card brands get to decide, and I've got a pretty good idea that they're not going to let you get away with that. So, yeah, no. Nice try. The other thing is plan for the client to maybe not always come up with the best solution for remediation. Let's say you've got in and they've decided that they're going to spend $1 million implementing some sort of, I don't know, NAC solution to keep people from getting in. And if you spent, maybe if you'd been on the phone with them for 15 minutes, you could have pointed out that, hey, NAC is not everything it's supposed to be, and we can bypass that with this and, save them some money. So it's important. Don't just deliver the report and walk away. You can do that with a lot of other pen tests because, they don't have to fix anything. With PCI, stick around. Advise them. Tell them, hey, before you spend any time or money or effort in remediation, let's sit down and talk about it. Let's do a tabletop discussion because, I'll bring a couple of my smart guys and they can probably, tell us right up front whether or not your solution has a chance of being effective. Or if we've seen it before and we've already bypassed it, we're going to save you some time and some energy. So retesting is important with PCI. In fact, it's one of the few regulatory regimes that requires that you come back and make sure that notable exploited vulnerabilities have been corrected. So there are two ways that you can do this. You can either do direct observation, you do the testing yourself. The customer has cross-site scripting and they fix it and then you go in and you retest it. Well, that's direct observation. You've done it. The other way you can do this is through review of documents, where the customer sends you screenshots or output from something. Let's say they had LLM&R in the environment and you made them fix it. Well, send me evidence that you applied the GPU across all the systems and send me a PCAP file. Well, I'll review that. And that's sufficient. So sometimes I don't need to go back out on site to do the test. I can just rely on the customer coming in and doing it. But what's important is that there is no sampling of evidence in PCI. So if you've got 60 boxes with Eternal Blue, then you need to have evidence showing that all 60 boxes have been fixed. You can't go with 10. You've got to have everything in order to make sure that they are effective. This regulatory regime could come back on the customer and you need to show that they've done everything that they could. All right, we are at 51 minutes. So in summary, it's this. You know what? The standard will drive your pen testing engagement if you look at it and pull out those pieces. It actually gives you the information. It gives you permission to do a really, really good pen test. And exploitation is required. This is fantastic. So take it, chain different vulnerabilities together, go further and deeper into the network than you might be doing otherwise. Remember, it's not us against them. We're there to bring value. We're there to make sure that they're secure. If we have this attitude, then it stops being a checkbox and we get a better job. We also develop a relationship with the customer where we become a trusted partner. And again, don't be afraid to be the expert. And being the expert sometimes means you have to say no, you have to push back, you have to say, this is how it is, I'm the expert, and then be able to tell them why, pointing back to the PCI documentation. And because if you do this correctly, I honestly believe that this could be one of the best pen tests that your client has ever had. All right, guys, thank you. It's 9 o'clock. You came in. I much appreciate it. If you have any questions, you can get some answers on the PCI Security Standards Council. This is where you can find these 4 documents. You can download them. You can find me at jperini@paysw.com, or I am jperini on the Twitters. Thank you. Oh, yeah, you got a question? Come talk to me. Oh, sure. Why not?
IP4, okay, we know that all those devices support IPv6 by default, it's enabled, so is PCI still valid if you're not validating that IPv6 is either turned on or off?
It's just another vulnerability, man. It's not, there's nothing special about IPv6. If it's not being used and properly set up, then what have we got? We've got man-in-the-middle attacks against IPv6 that we can use. If it's not appropriately configured, then it shouldn't be in the environment. So you would put that down as a finding.
So if the tester does not test to see if that's even on the network, is the test still valid? Is the PCI test still valid? Is the tester actually taking responsibility and risk for that?
Well, the tester's taking some risk, but you got to ask: did he miss it because he didn't look for it? Did he miss it because he didn't have time? There are things that you miss in a pen test. That is the reality of pen testing. But it should be in your methodology to test it, to look for it.
I'm only bringing this up because it's been 15 years I've been asking for this for PCI.
Yeah.
Included as a checkbox as
It's not. Again, it's like saying, is it patched, or does a vulnerability exist in a system? Yeah, it should be something you're checking. There's a lot of stuff in IPv6 that, heck, we don't even have to at this point do, because there's all this other sort of stuff. But the fact that it exists there and it's not configured properly is a vulnerability that should be listed in a report.
It just gets to reporting faster is what's happening.
Yeah. Does that satisfy your question?
Yeah, we're getting to where I'm hoping that PCI gets to.
Yeah, me too. But it's up to us. So, again, if we see issues like that, we need to document it and educate the customer on it.
So, as the credit card companies actually have included this as part of the requirements, are they actually taking the risk for the whole industry?
Again, you're approaching IPv6 as though it's something special. It's just another vulnerability. So they don't have to call it out. They don't call out Eternal Blue. They don't call out ARP poisoning. It's just another vulnerability. If the pen testers aren't looking for it, well, that's not the PCI Council's fault or responsibility. Make sense?
Yeah, it does. It's still not there yet. Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Any other questions? Cool. All right. Again, thanks, guys.